Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of my history podcast. Today, we're going to be discussing the First World War. The First World War is not as well known as the Second World War, and it's a bit more confusing to understand because its causes weren't so straightforward. To understand them, you have to go back at least a few decades from when the war began. In the later half of the 1800s, there was a rivalry between the French and the newly formed German Empire. The German Empire had been created by Otto von Bismarck when the Prussian Empire consolidated a bunch of the small German states into one major empire. However, the French didn't like this. They didn't want Germany to expand and become powerful. So their ambitious emperor, Napoleon III, decided to wage a war. In this war, France was humiliated and lost a large amount of important territory to Germany, and also emboldened the Germans and allowed them to make a comeback as a military power. As a result, the Germany began to increase in power over time and industrialize rapidly, which it had already been doing at the time, eventually getting into an arms race with the British over naval power. Both sides wanted to stockpile the biggest navy in the world, and the British were ahead so far, with the Royal Navy having dominated the seas for hundreds of years. However, the Germans really wanted to fight back, and started developing new innovations, such as U-boats, that they could use to gain naval supremacy. In addition, something happened called the Scramble for Africa. Basically, all the European powers got together and agreed that they were going to take different parts of Africa and harness its natural resources. Of course, no African nations were invited to the summit, but all the European powers decided to carve up the lands that belonged to those nations among themselves. This resulted in a lot of fighting over who got what land, and a lot of resources were at stake. This competition created a few rivalries between European states, but it also provided the resources to make the empires of Europe even stronger and more industrialized, allowing them to field larger armies and better technology. Moving ahead a few decades, you start to see the effect of nationalism in Europe. Up until this point, people really didn't care what country they were a part of. There was patriotism and the idea of being French or being German, but it didn't seem as that big of a deal for smaller groups. But now, new nationalist groups were coming up, and small groups of people, like the Serbs, who were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and all kinds of other people like Czechs, all wanted their own countries. This caused a lot of division within the big European empires, which comprised, naturally, of multi-ethnic populations. This was especially a problem for Austria-Hungary. The Austro-Hungarian Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, was one of the biggest supporters of creating an Austro-Hungary for Austro-Hungarians. And as a result, a Serbian terrorist group called the Black Hand targeted him for assassination. On July 28, 1914, they successfully assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and the Austro-Hungarian crown blamed the country of Serbia for funding these Serbian nationalists. However, it's unclear whether they did. As a result, Austria-Hungary sent Serbia a list of a ton of things that they had to do in order to avoid war. Serbia agreed and did all of them, except for one. So Austria-Hungary declared war. Now, another thing to note was people were starting to get scared that a large war would break out like the Napoleonic Wars before. These caused a lot of damage, and people didn't want to have to lose all that property and equipment and lives again. So countries started doing something similar to mutually assured destruction, where they would align themselves with as many other countries as possible to create a super strong, tight-knit pact that would discourage people from invading them. Unfortunately, this didn't work. Instead, the two big, strong pacts just decided to attack each other in a giant, large-scale war. In this case, those pacts are the Triple Entente, or basically the World War I equivalent of the Allies, and the Central Powers. The Triple Entente consisted of Great Britain, France, and Russia, who all agreed to support each other if a war came down. However, Russia also agreed to support Serbia if Germany mobilized, which Germany decided to support Austria-Hungary in the Central Powers alliance, which also included Italy, although that's kind of complicated, and Italy ended up joining the war on the side of the Entente. Anyway, basically what happened was Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. So Germany assisted Austria-Hungary and declared war on Serbia, which led to Russia declaring war on Germany and Austria-Hungary, and then that pulled in a bunch of other countries, including the Ottoman Empire and various other nations across the world, including Japan. Overall, this was the first time a conflict of this scale had occurred, and fighting took place all over the world. In Africa, in Europe, and even in the Pacific. One of the things that set this war apart, though, was the extreme death toll. Unlike previous wars, which were normally fought with pitched battles and big, high casualty events fought between combatants, the First World War had a blend of new technologies and old tactics. A bunch of new, deadlier innovations were made, like the Maxim gun, which is basically a machine gun that could fire extremely fast and take down a lot of soldiers very quickly. If such a weapon had existed in the past, entire field armies would have been mowed down. But soldiers and commanders didn't know how to deal with this yet, so they couldn't adapt to the new innovations. In addition, planes were used to scout out enemy locations, and the old idea of trench warfare had to be used because otherwise there's no way an army could survive that long against such overpowering force. Unfortunately for the soldiers in the trenches were often muddy, dirty, and full of infectious bacteria and viruses, eventually leading to the Spanish flu. Experts disagree on where it came from, but the consensus is that the Spanish flu was an incredibly deadly disease that was spread around the world by troop movements and exacerbated by bad conditions in the trenches. As a result, a large amount of people, more than the amount who actually died in combat, died of the Spanish flu. And not just soldiers either. People all over the world died. It caused the first ever major pandemic in American history and was a bigger issue than the COVID-19 pandemic by at least an order of magnitude, leading to millions of deaths. However, this wasn't the only mass killer in the trenches. The Germans had first used chlorine gas to attack a city in Belgium. However, the Allies soon followed suit. Gas warfare was extremely brutal as it basically suffocated your enemies and caused blistering boils all over them. It required you to wear heavy, soggy gas masks in order to protect yourself from it. And it encumbered the soldiers who were wearing them. Chemical warfare was also first invented in the First World War. It started with the Germans using gas against a town in Belgium. However, eventually the Triple Entente and the Central Powers were both using gas at a large level. Contrary to popular belief, it didn't actually result in that many casualties, but it was an extremely painful and damaging weapon to go up against and could lead to permanent failure of multiple bodily systems and could result in blindness or burns. Eventually, however, the Triple Entente gained the upper hand and pushed the Central Powers back. The Central Powers surrendered, and they signed the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles unfairly blamed the Germans for the entire war, placing an extreme financial burden on them to pay for all of the reparations for the war. As a result, the Germans turned to a new ideology that promised to fix all their problems: fascism. This is covered more in depth in my World War II video, so I won't touch on it here. Basically, the Treaty of Versailles set the scene for the next World War, and it changed up the entire world. In it, multiple dynasties were carved up and destroyed. The Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Germans, and the Russians all lost their monarchies, and the age of monarchy in Europe was basically over. It was now the time for large republics and constitutional monarchies and despotisms to take over. That was the legacy of the First World War. Thank you.